Hello and welcome to our monthly life science coffee break. Today on the topic of clinical trials in the medical device area, tips and tricks for clinical trial negotiations. My name is Sarah and I'm a lawyer at the life science team at Taylor Wessing in Munich. In my daily practice, I review and draft agreements in the pharmaceutical and medical device area, specifically clinical trial agreements. In the beginning of today's webinar, I quickly want to give you a brief outlook on the regulatory aspects of clinical trials in the medical device area by talking about the key regulatory framework that is applicable to clinical trials of medical devices, the differentiation between a clinical evaluation and a clinical investigation. After we have covered the regulatory aspects, we will talk about clinical trial agreements and what terms to include in these clinical trial agreements. If you have any general questions on either medical devices, obstacles for your clinical trials, or the terms of clinical trial agreements, you can use the question function on this platform. And I will come back to your question at the end of this webinar. You can alternatively contact me via my email, which you will find at the end of the presentation, which will be provided to you via email. This webinar is also recorded and uploaded to our website, so you can rewatch it if you want to. So, starting on the key regulatory framework for clinical trials on medical devices. On the European level, the medical device regulation governs medical devices, clinical trials, and the roles and responsibilities of the economic operators. Economic operators are to be understood as, for example, manufacturers, distributors, or importers. The medical device regulation further stipulates requirements for medical devices. A very vital provision of the medical device regulation is that only medical devices that have obtained a CE marking are legally allowed to be placed on the market. In order to obtain a CE marking, you will first have to confirm that the general safety and performance requirements that are that the general performance and safety requirements of the MDR are met. This will be either via a clinical evaluation or a clinical investigation. More on that is coming later. If you are conducting the clinical trial in Germany, you will have to further comply with the German Medical Device Operator Regulation, or the Medizinproduktebetreiberverordnung in German. As the Medical Device Regulation is a regulation and not a directive, the MDR is directly applicable in all member states of the European Union. Therefore, the German Medical Device Operator Regulation does not implement the MDR into German law, but supplements it. So, in addition to the provisions of the MDR, the provisions of the German Medical Device Operator Regulation are to be fulfilled. The German Medical Device Operator Regulation gives national particularities, such as specific requirements for clinical trials. For example, the German procedure to authorize the clinical trial. As already shortly mentioned, there is a clinical evaluation of medical devices. Manufacturers are obligated to perform a clinical evaluation for many different purposes. A clinical evaluation is to be understood as a systematic and planned process to continuously generate, collect, analyze, and assess the clinical data pertaining to a device in order to verify the safety and performance, including clinical benefits, of the device when used as intended by the manufacturer. As you can see from this definition, the clinical evaluation is a theoretical assessment of already existing data. So the manufacturer will look at clinical trials that have already been conducted or literature that is already available at the time of the clinical evaluation. The clinical evaluation is performed to demonstrate conformity with safety and performance requirements of the MDR, evaluate undesirable side effects, and the acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio. The clinical evaluation is an ongoing process and is conducted throughout the entire life cycle of the device, from the early stages of the development until the device is taken from the market. So, for example, as already mentioned, the clinical evaluation is a tool to be conducted in order to obtain the CE marking, but can also be conducted as a sort of follow-up after the medical device has already been placed on the market. The clinical evaluation is to be differentiated from clinical investigations. A clinical investigation is a systematic investigation involving one or more human subjects undertaken to assess the safety or performance of a device. So as you can see from this definition and the definition of a clinical evaluation, while a clinical evaluation is undertaken with already existing data, a clinical investigation aims to produce more data by using the device on human subjects. As you can imagine, a clinical investigation that needs human subjects also needs personnel and also requires a lot of funding. Therefore, manufacturers of medical devices should always assess on a case-to-case basis whether the clinical investigation is actually needed in the specific case and for the specific purpose. For some forms or some types of clinical medical devices, clinical investigations are mandatory under the MDR. This would be for implantable medical devices and Class 3 medical devices. Class 3 medical devices are very high-risk devices, for example, pacemakers. Another mandatory clinical investigation must be conducted for products listed in Annex 16 of the MDR, which are products that are always considered medical devices, which would be, for example, a contact lens or a product that is intended to be inserted into the human body. It is to be noted, though, that for these three device forms, exceptions exist, and we will come back to these exceptions for mandatory clinical investigations in our next slide. For all other medical devices that are not listed here, the clinical investigation is not mandatory under the MDR. Rather, the manufacturer of the medical device is obligated to assess whether the clinical evaluation is sufficient or whether the clinical evaluation shows that there is not sufficient data to support the specific purpose and support that the medical device is safe and complies to the performance requirements, and therefore a clinical investigation is needed. So the MDR places the responsibility of the decision of whether to conduct a clinical investigation on the manufacturers themselves. So for the examples, when is a clinical investigation not required? Is already mentioned if there is sufficient and adequate existing clinical data that shows that the device is safe and fulfills all performance requirements, the manufacturer can decide to rely on those existing clinical data. This exception is not applicable to implantable devices and class 3 medical devices, so the devices that are very high in risk. For these two devices, the equivalence assessment is a possible exception to the conduct of a clinical investigation. Under the equivalence assessment, there is an investigation or an evaluation of predecessor medical devices of the manufacturer or of comparative devices of other manufacturers. These comparative devices are evaluated on differences, for example, biological, technical, and clinical. And if these compare to the medical device, then the data from these comparative devices can be used for the clinical evaluation. Here is a brief outlook, a quick side note to the different types of clinical investigation and clinical evaluations. As mentioned, clinical evaluations and clinical investigations can be conducted for very different purposes. For example, if you have a medical device that is already CE marked, but you want to conduct a conformity procedure to get a CE mark outside of the already CE marked intended purpose, so you want to confirm that the device can be safely used for another purpose, you would again have to conduct either a clinical investigation or a clinical evaluation. This is just to show what can be done under the MDR, and you can have a look at it at a later stage if you want to. If the manufacturer has decided that a clinical investigation is needed, normally a clinical trial agreement is concluded between the sponsor of the clinical trial, which could be the manufacturer, but could also be an outsourced service provider, and the institution which will eventually conduct a clinical trial. In our daily practice, we always recommend to conclude a written clinical trial agreement. This not only serves for evidence purposes, for example, to prove to regulatory authorities or ethics committees that all the involved parties adhere to their regulatory obligations, but also to assign all necessary rights to the sponsor. Now let's dive into the essential contract terms. The manufacturer or the sponsor would, at a first step, need to decide which contract template to use. It is important to note that in some member states of the European Union, such as France and Italy, there are official standard contract templates for clinical trials with medical devices, which are mandatory to use. These contract templates are issued by either regulatory authorities or an ethics committee, and sponsors and institutions must use these templates. In Germany, at this point in time, no standard contract templates exist. However, under the new German Medical Research Act, there is the intention to implement standard contractual clauses for clinical trials with, however, medicinal products only. So these standard contractual clauses will only directly apply at this moment in time for pharmaceutical products. As these standard contractual clauses have not been published yet, we have not been able to assess them yet, and we cannot say at this moment in time whether the standard contractual clauses can be applicable to medical devices. Another decision that the sponsor should make is to whether use its own contract template or ask the institution whether the institution has a contract template to use. This decision is not easy in practice, as both can have their downfalls but also their benefits. It can be more time efficient to use the template of the institution. However, it has been shown in our daily practice that templates of institutions are in most cases not favorable to the sponsor, particularly in the IP section. So therefore, please, if you use the contract template of the institution, review these clauses with an expert just to be on the safe side. The contract terms of the clinical trial agreement should also reflect the regulatory aspects that the sponsor of the clinical trial is subject to. It must be noted that regulatory obligations of the MDR and the German Medical Device Operator Regulation, for example, are only specifically addressed to the sponsor of the clinical trial and not to the institution. Therefore, these regulatory obligations do not apply to the institution automatically, but must be contractually agreed upon between the parties. So for the sponsor, in order to be able to fulfill its regulatory obligations under the MDR, such as record keeping or monitoring the conduct of the clinical trial, monitoring the institution itself, contractual obligations are necessary to obligate the institution to either fulfill these regulatory obligations themselves or support the sponsor in fulfilling these regulatory obligations. In the next slide, I have included a few examples for these regulatory aspects of clinical trial agreements. For example, as the sponsor is obligated to conduct the clinical trial in compliance with applicable law, like the MDR and the study protocol, it is always recommended to give this regulatory obligation to the institution themselves and obligate them to comply specifically with certain aspects of the MDR and the study protocol. Another big aspect that is really crucial for fulfilling the role of the sponsor is that the institution is obligated to report certain events to the sponsor in due time. The sponsor under the MDR is obligated to report serious adverse events or device deficiencies to the regulatory authorities, and as the sponsor does not conduct the clinical trial itself and the institution is more close to these events, the institution must be obligated to report these events either to the sponsor or to the authorities. As the sponsor, as already said, is obligated to monitor the institution and the conduct of the clinical trial, audit rights should be included so that either the sponsor or an external service provider, such as a research organization is allowed to come into the institution and audit them on whether they comply with the agreement and the study protocol. Another sort of regulatory aspect is the compliance aspect of clinical trials. Under German law, the contracting with healthcare organizations or healthcare professionals is always a little bit problematic because there are certain compliance aspects such as professional law, the German Act on Medicinal Products Advertisement, and criminal law to be adhered to. When dealing with healthcare organizations, the other party should always focus that the institution or the healthcare organization does not receive consideration without, benefit without consideration. So, for example, it would be not compliant with, for example, criminal law to provide an item such as a medical device for the institution to use as they want. It is allowed, though, to provide the institution with the medical device for the purpose of the clinical trial. So therefore, the clinical trial agreement should state specifically that the medical device is only loaned for the time of the clinical trial and must not be used for other purposes. After the clinical trial, the medical device should be given back or should be destroyed. In terms of no benefits without consideration, the payment terms should specify a concrete budget per patient that represents fair market value, because sponsors should not, in no case, overpay the institution, as this could be a compliance, this could be an issue under criminal law. The payment should also only be made to the institution and not individual persons like the investigator, as this could also be an issue under criminal law such as corruption or bribery. Lastly, we will come to the commercial aspects of clinical trial agreements. In this category, we always tell our sponsors that the protection and use of the results and inventions made in relation to the medical device during the clinical trial is really crucial. Therefore, there should be a confidentiality clause in the clinical trial agreement that protects proprietary information in regard to the medical device, but also to the clinical trial. If, for example, there are certain events happening like a device deficiency, this should not go into the public, but only to the regulatory authority that requires reporting. Another point is rights to results and inventions. As the sponsor of the device wants to use the data and the results and the inventions of the clinical trial, it should be made sure that all intellectual property collected under this clinical trial is clearly assigned to the sponsor. When dealing with universities or university clinics, there's also the German Employee Invention Act to be complied to. Under the German Employee Invention Act, the Arbeitnehmererfindungsgesetz in German, normally employees are obligated to report their work inventions to their employer. For universities, there is an exception, which gives them the so-called negative right of publication. So they are not obligated to tell their employer that they have made an invention. as this clearly contradicts the sponsor's intention to be able to use all inventions, as the institution cannot physically is not able to provide any invention to the sponsor if it was not reported to the institution. The institution should always be obligated under the clinical trial agreement to only use personnel and staff which has priorly to its engagement under the clinical trial waived this negative right of publication. So therefore, in our clinical trial agreements, we always include as an annex a little waiver with which the personnel can waive the negative publication right. This was clinical trial agreements in a nutshell. I try to stick to the most important points. Therefore, if you have any questions, you can now use the question function. Okay, I can see some questions here. Let me just shortly go through them. So we have a question, do the obligations and standard clauses apply only where the device itself is under investigation or to any trial where a device is used? So I assume that this question refers to German law. I'm not really sure, but in German law, the contractual clauses are firstly not mandatory and at the time not intended to be used with medical devices, but only with pharmaceuticals. For pharmaceuticals, this is another point, and we had this in our last webinar with Irina Rebin. If you want to hear more on these contractual clauses under German law, we can include the link in my presentation. Do you have an overview which laws similar to Medizinprodukte-Betreiberverordnung, so the German medical device operator regulation, apply in other EU countries? Not at the moment, but in general, most countries will have a similar version. For example, in Greece, there are standard templates to be used, but I think they are not mandatory. I'm not really sure at the moment, but there are in every EU country laws similar to the Medizinprodukte-Betreiberverordnung. Then a last question is, can you please explain the criminal law example again? How did it connect to the adherence with specific compliance aspects? Sure, maybe we can switch to, yeah, this was the slide. Under German law, compliance aspects like anti-bribery, anti-corruption are really important. If you give a healthcare organization or a healthcare professional a benefit without consideration, so either you overpay them or they do not perform at all for what they are receiving under the contract, this could be seen as corruption or bribery. Therefore, it must be made sure that everything that the institution is getting or is receiving under the clinical trial agreement represents either fair market value or can only be used for a specific purpose, like the conduct of the clinical trial. With these compliance aspects, both parties can be liable. So the healthcare organization or the healthcare professional may not legally take the benefit without consideration, but the sponsor may not give the may also not give the benefit without consideration. So therefore, both parties have to be really careful with these compliance aspects and have to really look out that they are not having troubles with these obligations. I think these were all questions. If you have any more questions left, I will be happy to answer them if you drop me an email. As already said, my email will be provided to you within the slides. If there are no questions left, thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you so much for your patience. I know this is a very difficult problem with these clinical trial agreements and medical devices. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a very good day.